But if it's okay,
Worst case, I can reconnect with my my cell phone.
yeah.
It'll take about a minute. Well, a couple minutes to connect and come back if we have to.
Okay. Well, we will see if it comes to that. At the moment, I'm going to officially start the webinar. So I'm going to start letting people in, and then in just another minute, we will get going with that. Okay. To everyone joining, good afternoon. We have a good number of people joining this afternoon, so I'm going to give just a minute or so for people to fill in. That said, we've got plenty to go through today, even with our slightly extended runtime of an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to give people just about one more or so minute, and then we are going to get right to things. And Chris, if you're there, are we going on the YouTube side of things?
We are ready and rolling.
Okay, terrific. Okay, I am gonna get it going now, and let's see. I'm recording it locally to my computer, so hopefully, if nothing else, we'll have a redundant file. But okay, I take it by the number of people that we've had tune in that that our guest today needs minimal introduction. I'll do that in a moment, but quickly, a very little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, for those faculty network members of ours who have tuned in, just a quick word that you'll see our next newsletter coming in your inboxes should be this Thursday afternoon sometime. And with that, among other news, for those interested in attending our fall academic conference in Chicago in October, there will be information on how to apply for that. So keep an eye peeled for your inbox, to your email inboxes. And thank you to all of our faculty network members and all of our donors and other supporters who are joining us this afternoon. Now, moving on to the main attraction for today. I have been at FIRE for 13 years, which means in my 13 years here, I've been able a number of times to see Jonathan Rauch lecture our conferences and galas, and it has always been a treat and a treasure for me. You might know Jonathan Rauch from his writings and outlets as varied as the New Republic, National Journal, and The Atlantic. You might know him from his 1993 publication of Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, which any FIRE staffer will tell you is a staple of our reading lists. And we are here with him today to discuss his new book out out June 22nd by Brookings Institution Press, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. And Jonathan has brought a presentation with him today. We're going to go a little over the usual hour. We have Jonathan until just a little bit before 5:15 this afternoon, so I'm going to hand it right over to him. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, FIRE. I've been a charter fan and supporter since it was founded. And thank you all for being here today. There's a lot of material in my new book about academia and problems and issues there. But even though that's very relevant to this group, I want to focus on just in the book and maybe a large, I think even more urgent set of messages. And that's to talk about the epistemic crisis in America today, and what that means, and what I should mention, by the way, I'm probably over here in a little box on the side, and that my internet connection's unstable. If everything goes completely kablooey, I may have to pull out and come back in using my cell phone or something, but we'll hope for the best. So just that technical note. Epistemic crisis, what the heck, what importance, what should we do about it? That's the question I'm going to try to talk to you for the next 40 minutes so today. But I want to first start by rolling the tape a little bit. That is, if I can get this slide. September 11th, 2014, word spreads online of an explosion, chemical plant, Centerville, Louisiana. You can see Anna Russell with a name from a video on the right. Now, the odd thing about this particular explosion is that it did not, in fact, happen when call the plant and check in. No incident of any kind. Local Homeland Security authorities in Louisiana say, personally, I think it's just someone with a real sad, sick sense of humor. Well, that was what we thought. Someone with a sad, sick sense of humor for a couple of years. But take a closer look at that person on the upper left, Anna Russell. Who is that person? That's someone here, this research agency, Miss Troll Farm and Disinformation Factory in St. Petersburg, Russia. What they were doing was information network, see if they could alarm people. Information infiltrated into our system. They did a few months later with even more success by convincing a lot of Americans that a routine military exercise in the Southwest United States might be a military coup. They actually got the governor to order the state guard to monitor the exercise in case it was a coup. Now, we didn't know what we were looking at. Here's something else that was going on in 2014. This is a man, Ike. He was briefly the CEO of Mozilla, which is Internet Corporation. Some people online discovered that 6 years prior, in 2008, he donated $1,000 to the campaign in California, and they launched an internet campaign to get him fired. Days later, it happened. He stepped down, and Mozilla issued what soon in cases like, we're sorry, we must do better. A gay rights advocate and a gay marriage advocate, I've wrongly opposed Position 8, but I joined more than 50 other supporters in writing a public letter saying this can't be right. We're in a world where you get fired disagreeing with us. Well, little did we know back in 2014, wasn't all that long ago, but little did we know that what we were seeing was the new age, and that here's we would wind up. Only a few years later, 75% of Republicans believe the election was in an unprecedented and massive fraud from Trump. Political uncharted waters for the first time since political America is a democracy. Friends, we've just never seen anything like this ignoring a reality from such a section of the population. And here's something else about where we are. We have this name, this word canceling. chilling is also part of the story here. This is a poll from last summer. Asked people if they agree that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others find them offensive. 62% of the American public agrees with that, and an even higher number, 67 or so percent of college students agree to that with reference to their own campus. And look at this. It's not just conservatives. The majority of every category of 5 categories, including liberals, now feel chilled. And look what happens here to strong liberals. These are progressives. These are the people who might be least worried about this. In just 3 years, their level of concern about being chilled just by 12 percentage points, a very big jump to 42%. Not quite but darn near half. And how about this one? This question in some ways is more worried about losing your job or missing out on job opportunities if your political opinion becomes known. Nationally is a third. It's all political categories. This chilling, whatever's going, is not capped to any one political category. And if someone says cancel culture isn't a problem, it's like this and say, well, what do you think about that? So what are we talking about here? Well, Barack Obama put it this way. A lot of others have said the same thing. If we do not have the capacity to distinguish truth from what's false, then by definition, the marketplace of ideas, by definition, our democracy, we are entering epistemological crisis. To say, I usually say epistemic crisis. Okay. What are we talking about?
Hey, Jonathan, I'm gonna.
Yeah.
I'm gonna step in for just a moment. I've had a couple of people tell me they're having a little bit of trouble with your audio cutting in and out. I know we talked about this at the outset. Would it be possible to see if you might try stepping out and stepping back in and seeing if that improves the audio?
Okay. Should I try changing my my internet at the time? But maybe.
I'm not honestly sure what the best and easiest way might be.
Well, let me just do that because I'm guessing that this is a provider problem. This will take me 3 or 4 months. I'm and duck out, and hopefully we'll be able to get back here in 4 to 5 minutes. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. We're with you, John. So I will.
All right.
I will find a way to entertain.
All right. With apologies. Did our friends hear the colloquy we just had, so they know the story?
Yes, I believe so, but I will make it clear again.
Okay. See you in a minute.
Okay. All right, everybody, thanks. Thanks for hanging with us. I see. That's a good suggestion. A good suggestion, Aaron, in terms of possibly having him cut his camera and saving on bandwidth that way. If we continue having trouble with that, I will suggest that. Yeah, give us just another hopefully couple minutes, and we will hopefully have this resolved and hopefully carry on. Thanks, everybody.
I think I'm back. Am I back?
You are back. And
All right.
you're sounding good, at least presently. A suggestion that a couple
Okay.
people have had, and that could work, is that if we continue having audio troubles, that maybe you could save bandwidth on your end by just going by turning off your camera and just being audio only. But in the meantime, let's see how we'll see how
Okay.
this
Yeah,
goes.
that of course won't work with the audio visual elements. So let's see if we can make
Oh, that is true.
serve. Fingers crossed. Whoops. Stop share. Share screen. Well, I'm still getting internet data going on. This is an entirely different. Worst case, I will turn off the slides and talk. Where I was, should I resume and we'll see how it goes?
Yeah, we can try picking it back up from where you were.
Okay. Folks, I'm sorry about these technical difficulties. I don't know what's on. If it continues, as someone suggested, I'll just talk through it and not show you all this stuff.
Yeah. Or you can it won't be quite the same effect, but you could always rejoin either through your cell phone or rejoin through your cell phone and kind of talk us through the slides, even though we might not be able to see them all. One way or another, we'll get through this.
We'll get through it, yeah. Here's what I think an epistemic crisis is: the breakdown or disruption of a society's epistemic constitution. Public reality. For example, polarization, chilling, falseness, forking realities, ultimate governability, and civil war. A worrisome situation. And that's what I want to talk more about today. I want to leave you with three big ideas. Not a marketplace ideas. It's a contribution of knowledge, important difference that we need to understand. What's here is not an accident. Patients that are doing it on purpose, using well-known and effective tactics. Number three, we can get back. Not 10 feet tall, we are, but we need to understand what. So let's thank you.
John, I think we're unfortunately still having some of these same audio troubles.
Wow. Okay. Should I video? I mean, maybe at your end because it's a whole different provider. But let's. Yeah, I'm on my now. Okay. Well, maybe I should just turn off the slides, turn off video, and see if that's any better.
Let's try for that, John, and we'll see if that gets at the issue. I mean, I could always be wrong. I don't think it's on my end. I reserve the right to be wrong there. In keeping with the fallibility principle, as you've discussed in the Constitution of Knowledge.
All right. Well, we'll try this, and I'll just talk, and you'll miss some exciting footage. But so, big idea. What's the small or large, tribal or not? Some way to settle differences of civilly, productively. Very hard to do. It turns out. If you ask people in America, what's sort of our model, they'll tell you it's the marketplace of ideas. And they'll cite the famous analogy drawn by Oliver Wendell Holmes in Abrams versus US, where he said the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, and the best test of truth is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Now, the assumption here is is the, kind of an abstract realm in which ideas compete and we just talk to each unstructured way. But anyone who has made this presentation to undergraduates knows the first thing that they'll ask is, well, how do we know that the better ideas will prevail in the marketplace of ideas? Because after people in the marketplace buy a lot of crap. And that turns out to be a very profound, because it turns out if you just leave your own devices in a complete, you won't as people to prefer and indeed react cognitively more strongly to ideas that they find amenable, or the status in their, or else identity associate with others who, and then this will become their shared but terrible view of split and go to war, or they'll wind up with authoritarian leaders, what's true and what's not true, and so on. And that's how human society basically went for 200 years. And there's a couple of specific types of bias that we think about. Coordination bias. That's what I just set to that might be with our views. And the second is conformity bias, which is also quite interesting. There's a famous experiment. If we had video, I'd show it. But there's a famous people in a room. You tell them the division test, and you give them obvious. You ask them which of three parallel lines the same length as a fourth line, and you make it blindingly obvious so that there's just one clear right answer. Now, if you ask individual, right, because it's obvious, but suppose you put 8 people in the room. One is the experimental subject, but unbeknownst to the subject, 7 other people in the room have all been cued. They're actors, and they're going to give the same wrong answer. Well, it turns out a third of the time, the experimental subject will also give the wrong answer and will become uncertain. Well, maybe there's something I'm not getting. Maybe this is some kind of visual trick. 75% of people in trials will do this at least once. This is a pretty remarkable in the early 50s. It's held up well ever since. And this means when you think these two dynamics and they don't balance out, because we look for people who agree with us, we then conform with it, that cycle back into our views and so forth. We quickly go down a rabbit hole. So it turns out John Stuart Mill and Oliver Wendell Holmes in the marketplace of ideas, unstructured, is not enough. It turns out we need a social system that's going to guide us and steer us toward reality. And the guy we need to make that happen is someone we don't normally think of in epistemology, but that's James Madison. It turns out that Madison, the father of the US Constitution, was doing something that was very similar to what was done by the people over the 400 years since Isaac Newton, who basically created modern science and what I call the reality-based community, creating a set of social incentives and structures that compromise or persuasion and create specific incentives to cooperate and work with each other, whether in politics doesn't come to some sort of political consensus, or in epistemology to reach some sort of view as to what's true. The book, the real part of the book, the part that I think will last and maybe be read years from now, is where I develop the many similarities, structural similarities between the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of they're really very similar. It's not just a metaphor. They both use checks and balances to pit ambition against ambition and bias against bias. They both compel social negotiation, requiring compromise and persuasion. They both distribute authority quite widely, which prevents any one faction from seizing control. They impose impersonal rules like voting and empiricism, such that anything one person can do, anyone else should also be able to do, whether that's vote or criticize, debunk, or support a hypothesis. And above all, the part we often forget, especially if we're talking about the marketplace of ideas, is that they build institutions that regulate behavior and prevent chaos. On paper It's also the institutions that grow up around that. Some of those are constitutional institutions like Congress and the courts. Most of them actually grew up separately and subsequently, like judicial review and the political parties and so forth. But all of that stuff is the equipment we need, the social settings we need to incentivize us not to behave sociopathically in politics. And it turns out there's something very similar in the epistemic realm. I call it the reality-based community, which is a global network of people and institutions using impersonal rules to hunt for error. So what is the reality-based community? We're talking about institutions like universities and NIH and Brookings and government agencies like NOAA and the CIA, which is fact-based. We're talking about law and the courts, which are fact-driven and fact-seeking institutions. We're talking about conferences, seminars, discussions like this one, newsrooms, which bring journalists together with editors, fact checkers to try to what's worth pursuing and what's not. We're talking about scientific societies like the American Mathematical Societies and the AAUP and the AMA and the American Economic Association. These are extremely important in the development of science because they set the standards and they show us how to do the training and pass that training on to future generations. Of course, publications, everything from the Washington Post to the American Review, the Economist, and court decisions. And then there are the prizes. They're all the incentives. It's very important because you want to make errors. The genius, but it makes them and then finds fantastically new if you want to build knowledge. And we have all that ranging from citation in a footnote or in a legal brief all the way up to the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize. This is how you get famous. A well-constructed system. You figure out something that's true and I'll praise you for it. So people talk about gatekeepers, but it's really more like a pumping and work. Imagine an oil refining network, for example, or a water network where you've got just all of these nodes, all of these institutional points that we just talked, feeding each other and conversing with each other. And at any given moment, they're receiving hypothesis claims and deciding whether to pass them along. So they're like pumping and filtering stations. Here you see some graphics that I've shown. One of the great attributes of this network is that it scales fantastically. The number of nodes coming into this net has gone up substantially. I can't show you these charts, but one is the number of active academic journals over the 20th century. And it continues to rise in a century. Another is the number of internet co-authored papers. Lots of new societies developing are coming into this network big time. And just for example, the United States, the number of internationally co-authored papers, the percentage, has grown from the mid-20s to almost 40% in 10 years. That's just 2006 to 2016. Number of published papers on COVID, 0 in January of 2020. At last check in April, it was 133,000. It's probably 150,000 today. This system is just fantastically good at pumping and filtering, bringing in voice through. And the result of that is what we call objective knowledge, which is humanity's single greatest technology. Objective knowledge has transformed us as a species and allows us, as the psychologist says, to function far above our design capacity. With all due respect to subjectivists, objective knowledge is a real thing. You can drop it on foot, it will bruise your toe. If all humans were to die off in a catastrophe, an alien civilization would land on this planet in 1 million years, reconstitute our data libraries, and use that knowledge. It exists independently of us. It exists above and beyond any particular institution, individual, or lifespan. And it also put the shot in my arm that's protecting the team right now. So it turns out not everyone is on board with this project. Objective knowledge and making knowledge requires a lot of onerous tasks. You have to master whole disciplines. You have to be willing to lose an argument and move on. You have to be willing to choose people who are going to be highly critical of you. If you're a demagogue or a would-be dictator, the claims of reality will interfere with your ability to tell the stories that you want, which may this system has its enemies. Their second point, you're being, what do I mean by this? Well,
Jonathan,
I'm gonna talk.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to do this again. We were doing better for a bit there, but we're hitting more choppy patches with
Oh
the
my
audio.
goodness.
Um,
I don't know.
would it be possible we can try this one more? Are you talking from your laptop or from a cell phone? Remind me.
I am on my thing in TNT.
Wait, you said you're on your laptop at the moment?
Yeah, but I'm using it as a hotspot.
Okay.
I was using a wired connection, which is very fast, but that had the same problem.
And I wonder would dialing in through a mobile phone, would that conceivably
It might.
would that conceivably can we I'm
I
sorry to do this to you, John, but could we try that and see if we have a little bit more luck with the audio, and then we can get going on this again?
Yeah, I need to find phone number. I'm, let's see. I do not have a telephone. Okay, it looks like of the information to dial in. So I'll get a headset and a bit of other equipment. This will take needed presentation, but I guess that's fine.
We can do that, John. I will I will hold down the fort, and apologies for making you run around like this.
Well, it's obviously your fault. First time it's happened. So I don't know what's going on. All right. So I am now going to, I'll hopefully see you in a minute.
All right. Well, apologies for that, everyone. I knew COVID conditions were going to get their revenge at one point or another. We've been doing these webinars for 8 or so months on occasion, and that's the first time. That's the first time a faulty internet connection has threatened to do one of these. And I thought I was going to be the problem today because there's forecast for thunderstorms in the Boston, Cambridge area. So I was worried about having a big thunderclap coming in and interrupting the climax of Jonathan's audio. But oh well, we'll give it just another moment. I appreciate everyone bearing with us. This is not exactly how we imagine the afternoon going, but strength. in the meantime, while I have a
Hello.
moment. Oh, I
I might
see.
be here.
I hear you, Jonathan.
All right. Well, I'm I'm dialed in on a cell phone, and if this doesn't work, nothing will. And I'll truncate what I was doing, so that we have time for conversation.
I hear you.
How does it sound
I
now?
hear you pretty clearly. Fortunately, not especially loudly. We could maybe do a little bit better on the volume, but you are sounding clear.
All right. Well, I've got you as close to my mouth as I can. So
The increasingly the
maybe this
increasingly
helps.
degrading conditions. I'm having Jonathan Rauch do this for us, and I appreciate it, Jonathan. But you're sounding good right now. So if it's all right with you, let's just try and soldier
All right.
forward.
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll try to make the rest of this a bit shorter. So what I try to emphasize to people when I say you're being manipulated is that some very sophisticated tools of what I call epistemic warfare, information warfare, propaganda, are now being used by a variety of people. And what they're trying to do is weaponize the same kinds of cognitive vulnerabilities that the constitution of knowledge is designed to avoid, with the goals of dominating, dividing, disorienting, and demoralizing a target population. There are a bunch of these. They include trolling and conspiracy bootstrapping, but I'm going to focus on two very briefly, which are, I think, the two most significant right now. The first is disinformation. So it turns out that censorship is difficult and not very effective, and especially not very effective in the internet age. But something that is effective is a tactic that the Russians perfected. It's called the fire hose of falsehood. And Steve Bannon, who was an aide to Trump in the 2016 campaign and worked in the White House, summarized it very well. He said, the real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. If you just imagine pouring out so much lies, half-truths, propaganda, conspiracy theories that no one can keep up with it, and the pumping and filtering stations just overheat and break down, that's what they're doing. This was the preferred tactic of the KGB. We have their testimonies to tell us so. The Russians use it very effectively. For example, in 2018, Russian operatives used a Soviet nerve agent called Novichok to assassinate a pair of people in the UK. They failed in the assassination attempt, and the Novichok was discovered. And the Russians had an explanation for all this. In fact, they had more than one. They had many explanations, and they were mutually inconsistent. Britain poisoned them. Ukraine poisoned them. It was an accident. It was a suicide. It was a revenge killing. It was not a nerve agent. Russia didn't produce the nerve agent. It was a different nerve agent, and so forth and so on. It's an almost carnival-esque kind of overwhelming, disorienting kind of tactic. Well, who else can potentially use this tactic? We can flip to 2016. PolitiFact rated a lot of statements that were checkable by the two presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. 26% of what Hillary Clinton said was rated mostly false, or pants on fire, and about half of that was, false. Now, that's too much. It's kind of what we expect from politicians, and it's not good enough. But it's a contrast with Donald Trump, who was rated 71%, at least mostly false. Now, think about that. If the man was opening his mouth, what he was saying was likely to be mostly or entirely false. We have never seen that before in American politics. We have never seen anyone try it before. We have never seen anyone lie about the weather during his inauguration, or the crowd side during his inauguration. Obviously refutable lies, and that's the point. It's a confuse-a-thon. It's to disorient people so that they don't know what to believe or who to trust. We've never seen a president alter a weather map. In my slideshow, I have Trump displaying this. In 4 years, Trump puts forth, according to the Washington Post fact checker, over 30,000 false or misleading claims. And there's a significant ramp up in the months before the 2020 election. If you can see the chart, you would see it suddenly sharp rate of increase starting in April. What's going on in April? This is when Trump begins the campaign against mail-in voting. And, people like me at Brookings, political types, scratch their head and say, well, why would he do that? Because a lot of Republicans vote by mail, and there's a pandemic. That doesn't make sense. What we didn't realize was that Trump was not targeting the election. He was targeting the post-election. What he was doing was very much like what the Russians were doing with that bogus chemical plant explosion. He was testing, organizing, mobilizing, and testing his network and his message. He was telling his supporters in the Republican Party and conservative media that we're going to launch a disinformation campaign when I lose this election, because I think he thought he would. And he was testing that network. And indeed, after the election, he's tweeting constantly, 7, 8 times a day, the election was stolen. It's a repeated message. It's broadcast by Trump and from the White House and from Republican Party officials and on conservative media, and even lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits, dozens of them with mutually contradictory claims are used. Every possible channel is used to push out these massive volumes of claims. The goal here is to create cynicism and demoralization and confusion. And I quote people in the book. There's lots of examples. For example, one person tells the New York Times, there's no real news sources anymore. I don't trust anything. People get demoralized. Another person says, I guess I would have to say I'm completely confused as to who is lying and who is telling the truth. I just feel helpless. And so forth. These are tactics that are designed to soften the resistance of the population, to open the way to a demagogue, a dictator, a cult of personality, an alternative view of reality. And that is how we get to 75% of Republicans believing the election was stolen. This is not an accident. This didn't just happen. This isn't simply because of generic distrust in institutions. This was done to us. A second kind of tactic that I want to talk about for just a few minutes is what people tend to call these days canceling, a term that didn't exist when I started work on my book, but now a recognizable term that I've used. But I think of it as social coercion or coercive conformity. You remember that experiment I described earlier, where if there are 8 people in a room and 7 say something that's false, the 8th will tend to conform with that, often knowing it's not true, but also often actually doubting themselves. Well, it turns out you can weaponize that. If you use social coercion so that you can chill an entire side of the argument, you can have 2 effects. One is the immediate effect of course, you chill that side of the argument. If the proposition is X, then a lot of people will just be hesitant to say X. And that's a condition that you want to inculcate if you want to control and manipulate the information environment. But the second thing that happened goes back to our experiment, which is people will doubt themselves. You can stigmatize an argument, take a claim that might be controversial in many of your environments, like affirmative action backfires and hurts the people it's supposed to help. Well, that's an empirical proposition. There are lots of ways to test that, but you can stigmatize the whole idea of testing it, and you can make people feel like, well, it must be immoral to even entertain this idea because no one's talking about it. What you're doing here is creating what's called in sociology a spiral of silence. People look at other people to decide what they can believe. We have very acute sort of consensus detecting organs. And based on what they perceive other people to believe, if that consensus is manipulated so that it appears that a lot of people believe a minority view and very few people believe what would otherwise be the majority rule, you actually begin to work on people's minds. You begin to change their minds about what's right and wrong and moral and immoral. And here in my slideshow, I flip to some examples. It's not just conservatives that are hit by this. One of the big changes of the last 5 years is that it's turned out these targets are multi-ideology and they're readily deployed against progressives, and they have been. It's a famous case last summer when a socialist, actually very well-respected political analyst named David Shor, tweeted out an accurate summary of an academic paper, which, by the way, was written by a person of color, by an African American. This got on the wrong side of some activists. They did a pile-on. One of them tweeted David Shor's boss with the sinister sounding tweet, "Come get your boy." Shor apologized. He said, "I regret starting this conversation and will be much more careful moving forward." Nonetheless, fired the next day. Companies don't want to take these risks. Another famous example is, a guy is driving a truck. He's cracking his knuckles, holding his hand outside the car door, outside the window. Someone tweets that this looks like a white supremacist gesture. He's fired the next day. It's not just firing, it's social ostracism, which for a lot of people is even worse. It's the fact that your friends turn their back, they gang up on you, your view is unacceptable. Here are the deliverables. Include domination, demoralization, a sense of helplessness. For example, a professor. Got a lot of conversations with students and professors in this book. And they say things like, a student tells me certain points of view about touchy subjects never reach the surface. The result is an echo chamber. I think the saddest quote in my book was a liberal, progressive student at a liberal arts college that you've all heard of, saying that she regretted not having been exposed to conservative viewpoints in college, but she said that she at least consoled herself, as she put it, that she was exposed to a broad range of progressive viewpoints. Now, that's really not what a university is supposed to be about. But a lot of faculty, for example, feel completely helpless, and that's something else information warfare does. It's demoralizing. As one faculty member said, I feel I am constantly tiptoeing through a minefield. I feel there is absolutely nothing I can do as a single tenured professor to stop this. It's like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. And notice the minefield analogy. That's very telling. Canceling is not like criticism because you don't want people to know what might be safe to say. You don't want to provide safe harbors. Instead, you want people to overchill. You want them never to know what might be risky. To the extent you can do that, you can intimidate, you can demoralize, you can have these effects. That, I believe, is how you get to a situation where 67% or so of students and almost that many people in the American public say that they are afraid to speak out on their political views. These techniques, the two I've described and others that we don't have time to describe, they are well known. They are sophisticated. They date back 100 years or so. Lenin incorporated them, Hitler and Goebbels incorporated them, and they're effective. And they've been effective for Donald Trump, who I argue is a genius at propaganda. I think he's the greatest probably since Goebbels, since the 1930s, because he's done something no one else has figured out how to do or even had the audacity even to imagine, which is to adapt Russian-style disinformation techniques to American politics and do that audaciously and wholesale and very effectively. I think of what's going on here as epistemic warfare. It's often referred to as information warfare. I think epistemic is probably more accurate because it's designed to unmoor us from reality, from confidence about what's true and what's false, and from the reality-based community. So the third big point I want to leave people with is one I just usually summarize because it's worth talking about more in the Q&A. As I put it, they're not 10 feet tall, we are. Right now, with the flood of social media and disinformation and issues around canceling, and of course Trump and the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party I would now characterize as institutionally a propaganda organ. This feels overwhelming. This feels like, how do we ever get out of this? But we got to remember, this was a surprise attack. This is not something anyone prepared for. It wasn't even something that anyone imagined could happen. And it did turn out, unfortunately, that social and digital media technologies are just brilliantly designed for propaganda because they're designed to spread viral information regardless of truth value. But it also turns out that a lot can be done about this. We don't just need to accept it. People say, well, what do we do? And they're looking for the 3 bullet points. There aren't 3 bullet points. There are dozens and dozens of bullet points. We've had information disruptions in the past, the printing press, the penny press, offset printing, and they had very serious and costly disruptions. The way we responded was by kind of all of society, multi-institutional and individual responses on many levels, and we're already seeing some of those. And I'll just tick off a few. Individuals are getting savvier. If a population understands that it's being manipulated, it's somewhat harder to manipulate. Media are wising up. Reporting in 2020 was far more sophisticated about avoiding being played by disinformation, conspiracy theories, and that sort of thing. They were in 2016. Most major media organizations now have reporters who cover disinformation and propaganda. Watchdog organizations like the Stanford Internet Observatory, all over the world, academic in many cases, are studying disinformation, working their way into the networks, monitoring them, sometimes infiltrating them, giving early warning when conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns pop up. Digital platforms are being redesigned. A lot of them have tumbled to the fact that if Facebook and Twitter become toxic disinformation dumps, that's not a good business model. I believe the biggest changes in that world will not be policy changes like, the much vaunted Section 230 or content moderating rules. I think it's going to be redesigns to the way these platforms actually work. It's going to be product changes, and we're already seeing that. In Twitter, if you try to retweet a link that you haven't read, you'll get a billboard, an interpolation, which will say, do you really want to treat this without reading it? There's lots of experimentation of those kinds. And it turns out that these product changes can make a big difference. It's interesting to talk about those. Institutions are being designed and strengthened. A good example of that is the Facebook Oversight Board, which I take very seriously as an attempt to build an accountable institution to begin to set up some standards and guardrails. That's how we cleaned up American journalism, which, as many of you know, was just a wasteland of partisanship and unreality in the 19th century. Along came some people who said this won't do. They included Joseph Pulitzer, who was himself a yellow journalist, but they set up Pulitzer and other prizes, journalism school, American Society of Newspaper Editors created standards and ethics codes for journalists, like run corrections, check with people before you say things about them. And it worked. It took some time, but it worked. Liberals are counter-organizing. This is very important. In the world of canceling, the huge advantage has been that only one side is organized. On campus, there are these actually non-representative groups of activists who will come after someone if they don't like what they're saying. And lots of other people say, well, I'll graduate in a few years, or why should I put my position on the line to oppose these people? And so they don't. And as we know from public choice theory, organized minorities will beat disorganized majorities every time. But that's changing. We're seeing a sudden and very large upswell of new groups and new activism by old groups aimed at counter-mobilizing against illiberal tactics. And many of those people are progressives who have finally tumbled to the fact that these disinformation tactics are not ideological. They're not about progressive values. They're about domination. Schools, education, important part of it, media literacy, teaching critical thinking. This has proven effective in Europe, and I think could be effective here. Civil society is mobilizing. That's groups like Braver Angels, which I'm involved with, which are actually setting out to reconstruct social fabric and trust. And then finally, let's not forget this one because it's a big one. Trump was defeated. Now, that's not a moment to breathe a sigh of relief, but it does mean that for at least 4 years, the people running this massive disinformation campaign have lost their critical feature, which is the support of the White House, sections of the United States government, and so on. This is an unprecedented asset, and at least at the moment, they don't have it, which gives us an opportunity to do some building, and that's very important to remember. If we understand what's happening, if we mobilize to defeat it rather than throwing up our hands and saying, well, it's just social change and decline in institutions and it's the way the internet works and oh my gosh. If we fight it, we have very deep structural advantages. We have the whole reality-based network that I described earlier. We have another advantage, which is reality itself. Propagandists are very bad at staying in touch with reality. They go down their own rabbit holes. We see that in the Republican Party right now. They no longer know really what's true or what's false. They spin themselves with these stories and these lies, and they cannot build. Trump and his troll armies and the cancelers and all these other people, they can tear down. They're parasitic, though. They can destroy networks of reality, but they can't, for example, put the vaccine in my arm that's protecting me at this moment. So reality itself gives us a leg up. But I try to by emphasizing this is a subject on which to be hopeful, but also determined and not complacent. So that went a bit longer than I expected because we lost some time, but we do have 15 minutes for conversation, and I will try to keep my responses very short so that we can hear what others have to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'll get those started. We've had a couple of them come in, and people can feel free to continue leaving their questions. But I wondered if we might talk a little bit about something that we didn't really have the chance for in the lecture with all the kind of interruptions and technical difficulties, but something that you talk about throughout the Constitution of Knowledge as a kind of necessary but not sufficient condition for maintaining the integrity of these information checking systems that we have is the usefulness of viewpoint diversity. And especially as we're with a higher education crowd, we have a number of tenured faculty on the call with us. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about some of the things, that we have seen in terms of advancing that cause, but also maybe some of the ways that we've fallen short in that regard.
Well, the fallen short part is easy because many of you on this call already know the statistics that have emerged about the one-sidedness, the lack of viewpoint diversity in many academic disciplines, especially social sciences and humanities, on many campuses, especially liberal arts, but not only. And you also know, if you follow Heterodox Academy, that a lot of academics, including progressive academics, are getting worried about that. And the reason for that is the key to making the reality-based community work is diversity of view. You've got to have biases to set us against other biases, because we are blind to our own biases, no matter how smart we are. In fact, smart people are even better at being blind to our biases and making up stories that we want to tell ourselves. I think it's good news that academics are starting to become aware that this is a problem. We're also becoming more aware that there is a real problem of discrimination against conservatives. There would be a problem of discrimination against liberals. There just aren't that many conservatives to do it. But I think there is a road that now stretches in front of us, which is that viewpoint diversity needs to become a co-equal priority with other forms of diversity in academia. Now, you obviously can't hire, put out a job ad and say conservative wanted for sociology department, but you can knock down the structural barriers to hiring conservatives. You can look for ways to make the pipeline a more comfortable place for them. And that's very important, because remember, what cancel culture is all about, what information warfare is all about, is suppressing diversity.
And Jonathan, since you brought up cancel culture, and we were talking about it for a bit of the last part of the talk, something else that I was wondering, and that I was taking notes on when I was preparing for the webinar today. We talk about two of the major pillars threatening the Constitution of Knowledge. One is the propensity for disinformation that we see in a number of spheres, and the other being cancel culture. And looking at the two of them, they have some similarities and some real differences. They both very effectively use mass media to carry out their objectives in terms of in terms of television, in the case of the Ayatollah Khomeini and Salman Rushdie, as you discussed both here and in kind of the Inquisitors, the sort of open-endedness of where these campaigns might go once they started, and once the people who started them washed their hands of them. But there's also some real differences between the two that I can see. The ethos of disinformation is kind of flooding the zone, as we talked about, and when it comes to cancel culture, you can look at it as a way of enforcing a radically narrowed range of acceptable opinion on a certain very particular issue. And I guess another thing I would say that they have in common, might be the way that they sort of leave the people demoralized and feeling like there isn't very much that they
Yes.
can do to
Yes.
overcome the larger forces. And
Yes.
these are two things that I think we've seen both kind of accelerating in recent years. And I kind of wonder if they seem separate in some ways, but I'm wondering if you see kind of a push-pull at play between them.
Meaning between, say, the Trumpy kinds of disinformation we see on the right and the canceling kinds of efforts we see on the left?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question because obviously ideologically they're very different, yet both of these groups are using these different kinds of tactics to manipulate the information environment for political gain. And I don't know that they're inspired by each other. I guess I just tend to think that some moments in history come when you get these very powerful new tools and you get ruthless people who are willing to use them, and they start doing that on the left and right. So I suspect that's more of what's going on. But I do try to make this point that you just made so well. In fact, I think maybe better than I did. The people on the left and right of good faith need to recognize that these information warfare tools, the epistemic warfare tools, are not their friends. They're not your friends if you're a conservative or if you're a liberal. They're independent of those things, because what these tactics are designed to do is prevent change and enlighten progress in society. Whatever your views are, these tactics are designed against that kind of reasoned debate toward whatever you think is important.
I think maybe it's also possible. In fact, it's not so much possible. It's I think it's been pretty explicit that one of the I'm returning to higher education here, given our primary audience here, but I think a big something that we've seen a lot of from outside the higher education sphere is sort of the running against higher education and sort of various attempts to sort of delegitimize it, to call into question its authority and its moral compass. And I've been seeing I've been seeing this quite a lot at Fire, just from seeing, among other things, the waves of legislation suddenly that's taking direct aim at the teaching of certain conflicts, concepts in the classroom, critical race theory, any number of other kind of sensitive topics.
Yes, I'm terribly worried about that, and
so there's there's a real and institutions like higher education institutions are part of this constitution of knowledge, and they're
they're the long pole in the tent. So
Yeah.
I'll just say a word in response to that.
Sure.
Which is that one of the things that worries me the most about the lack of viewpoint diversity in college campuses is that it's harming the credibility of the whole scientific project by allowing conservatives to say they're just a bunch of liberals who talk to each other, and all too often to be right. There's been, I think in just the last 4 years, an approximately 20-point drop in public responding to polls that higher education is good for America, and the bulk of that is coming from the right. And it's largely driven by this increasing sense that these so-called experts are actually a bunch of leftists. And I think that's one of several very compelling reasons that the Academy needs to take this problem more seriously. Its credibility is at the absolute heart of the reality-based community. Nothing else will really work if people lose trust in that sector.
And one of the things that we've talked about, one way that universities can sort of can defend themselves is by increasing viewpoint diversity and in the faculty, and just even beyond the question of trying to get X number of conservatives in whatever field, just doing what they can to foster a more kind of open, inclusive climate for a variety of viewpoints. Are there is there anything else you might suggest for universities to kind of shore
Oh,
up
there's
their
tons.
defenses?
Yeah. There's a whole section about this in the book. So there's tons. I think there's a need for stronger leadership at the top to defend academic freedom. I think investigations should just not happen against faculty if it's First Amendment protected speech and there's no credible allegation of professional malfeasance. Those investigations just should stop, you know. I love the fact that some institutions like Purdue are actually doing First Amendment training sessions as part of their freshman orientation. But it's also important to express in other ways, right up front on the catalog page, the values of a university are places where you will be intellectually unsafe. There's a big chunk of the book on the problem of emotional safetyism, which I argue is a fundamentally illiberal doctrine. And I've said for a long time, there's one and only one trigger warning that I'm a fan of, and it should be right there on the front of the webpage, which is, at this university, you may encounter heretical, blasphemous, offensive, wrong-headed, or bigoted views at any time without warning, and we call this education.
John, because I've had a couple of my professor friends here chime in on the same sort of question. Is it something I can't remember? This is something that you outlined in the book, but in terms of in terms of universities' hiring practices, do you would you suggest going so far as to try and actively recruit heterodox thinking faculty, including that among the kind of portfolio of ways that that faculty might contribute to the diversity of an institution?
Well, there's a debate about that and about how
Yes.
far you can go, because as I said, you can't just say Republicans wanted.
Yes.
That's completely out of line.
Yes.
And you can't magically create a pipeline full of conservatives in fields like sociology, where there just really hardly are any. But then there's a range of options. I think one no-brainer is you just need to stop discriminating, and you need to have champions on campus who will actually look for discrimination, and where they find it, make sure and try to stop it. And that means where there are tests that look like they're ideological tests for hiring, you really shouldn't have that, and there should be people on campus who are tasked with reducing that. Then can you go a bit further? Can you say that viewpoint diversity is welcome in our department and really make that a fact and inculcate that? I think you can certainly do more of that without crossing into direct political hiring. And there's some people, Eric Kaufman, for example, who's written a very impressive and disturbing report about discrimination, who argues that at least for state universities, you're going to have some intervention by state legislatures. Not the kind we're seeing, not the kind that dictate outcomes, but at least some kind of reporting on what's going on, and at least some kind of accountability. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but he's a reputable guy making that case and proposing specific measures.
Sure. And I guess we have time for one last question, John, and I'll leave it with this again. Again with a nod to the many tenured faculty friends and colleagues that I have on the line. There is a significant role that the tenured faculty has to play in sort of protecting the mechanism of this constitution of knowledge.
Oh yeah.
And an ongoing challenge. This is something that FIRE has been dealing with for years, and which any number of faculty can attest to, which is that there are, even in spite of your tenured professorship, which comes with very strong job security protections, many still find it hard to take that kind of stand for for the academic freedom, for the free speech of their colleagues. Any particular message you'd like to leave our faculty listeners with there?
Well, the obvious one is don't be a snowflake. I completely understand why a junior professor without tenure would do things like, as one told me, remove a module from her brain biology course having to do with autism because one student complained about it. And her view was, well, why take the risk? I understand that person's in a very vulnerable position. Tenured faculty or not, I don't understand why they're not doing more to protect their academic freedom. Many of them say they're scared. The guy I quoted is himself tenured faculty, the guy who said it's like holding back the ocean with a broom. They're very demoralized. They feel they can't do anything. And that, of course, is the whole goal of epistemic warfare, to demoralize the other side. So part of this is individual, and it just means sucking it up and fighting harder. But even bigger than that, individuals indeed cannot do all that much on their own. I'm very heartened by the birth of the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is kind of a NATO for professors. The idea is if academic freedom is invaded against any professor anywhere, it's an offense against all. I think that could be helpful. I think FIRE's efforts are helpful, but there needs to be more direct support, more institutional and organizational support to encourage people to stand up so that they know others will have their back. They'll get emotional counseling if they need it, maybe legal resources if they need it. They'll get it strategic advice if they need it. And also so that others in the university, the activists who are waging these campaigns of harassment, intimidation, understand they're up against more than just one isolated individual. So it's got to be both. It's got to be individual, and it's also got to be organizational. And I think maybe it's starting to happen. You would know better than I, you guys at FIRE, but I think maybe that's beginning.
Well, I was definitely glad for the reasons you described to see the coming of groups like the Academic Freedom Alliance. You're always kind of wondering about who might be quote unquote getting in on your turf, but its mission in terms of providing a kind of visible beacon for faculty is a very welcome one, and it's something I'm definitely trying to do more here in terms of leveraging the collective expertise and knowledge of our faculty so that they can better directly help each other. Jonathan, I know you have another one of these to hop right onto, and I'm conscious of that. So I will wind it down right here. First of all, thank you so much to Jonathan. This has been a real pleasure for me, in spite of the internet's cancellation attempts on this affair.
Yeah, you guys missed a clip from Star Trek. So that's heartbreaking. But I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm very flattered to be asked to talk to this group. I hope you all investigate the book. There's a lot more about academia, and it really tries to be an intellectually serious, non-polemical understanding of what's going on behind a lot of these phenomena.
I can certainly recommend it highly myself, and I will do so to anyone else who asks. So I enjoy the book very much, Jonathan. I'll definitely keep it right. I'll keep it in arm's reach whenever I need to reference it during my work, which I imagine will be frequent. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you as well. All. Everyone, all our supporters and faculty who joined us and bared with us through the technical difficulties. We'll hopefully do a little bit better with that next time. But in the meantime, take care, and faculty members, stay tuned to your email for future dispatches from the network. We've got a lot of good, exciting programming coming up for you. So stay tuned and take care.